Happy fall Sabbath. I know it doesn't feel like fall, but it is fall. It's October. And here in Southern California, October means 102 degrees. So welcome, whether you're watching us here and you brave the heat to come to church, or you stayed at home and are relaxing in front of a screen in the air conditioning. We are delighted that you've joined us as we commence a new lesson study focused on what has to be perhaps my favorite of all the books of the New Testament. I'm, of course, referring to John. So we're going to get into John today. We're going to set the Johannine stage, but before we do that, we're going to go ahead and pray. Jesus, thank you for being Word. Thank you for enfleshing yourself. Thank you for dwelling among us. Thank you for calling us to life and to light. And for the next 13 weeks, we would ask that you give us the capacity to do that which is most important to the author of this gospel, that we may believe. We pray that you stay with us as we converse, for we pray in your name. Amen. So my co-host is here. We're going to pass the mic and the camera to my good friend Joey. Oh, Joey, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited for this new quarter. I don't know. Have we ever had Sabbath schools with two gospels back to back like this?
I don't
we
think
finished
we
Mark,
have.
we jump right into John.
Yeah,
I think it's really exciting.
It is. I'm really thrilled about this. John is, like I said, one of my favorites in the New Testament. It's funny how you spend enough time in the lesson, these things start going around. I was talking earlier this week with my colleague and friend John Pauline, who was reminding me at least, that all the way back in 2004, while we were students in undergrad, he actually wrote the quarterly to the Gospel of John.
Wow.
And some of those things made it in. Others of them are new. But it's funny how you stay with the Gospel enough, with the quarterlies enough, things kind of happen to come around. The approach this quarter is a little bit different than the one John took some 20 years ago. So we're going to jump in and start talking.
Yeah. It reminds me, there was a comedian I was watching who was talking about his father, how his father's a pastor, and how his father has a much harder job than he does because he gets new material, but his father has to give a book report on the same book every week over and over again. I don't think it's that difficult because there's so much to be mined, but that is interesting that, after a while we will cover the same material because it is still one Bible.
It is still one Bible. And what I was shocked, and I asked John, is really, John was until he came here at the seminary in Andrews, and he is kind of one of the preeminent Adventist Johannine scholars. And so I asked him, and he said, no, this is the first time that it's been covered in this way in 20 years. And that shocked me because I thought for sure it at least pops up once every 3 or 4 years. And apparently, no, it's taken a little more time for them to kind of come back to this particular gospel, which, as you said, is full of stuff that we can mine.
Wow, it's so dense with material that can be dwelt on. I know over the course of 13 weeks, we're going to try to crack beneath the surface a bit, but even after 13 weeks, there'll still be so much that we have left uncovered.
So much, and so we're going to start today. The lesson talks about 3 stories, right? Cana, a Roman official, and a pool of Bethesda. And it's incredible how all these little stories, or these snippets, these episodes in John's narrative are connected to John's bigger theme, which is you need to believe. I write these things so that you may believe. And in the first half of his gospel, John is going to lay out kind of these signs, 7 signs that he performs, not in order for people to kind of be healed, although obviously they are healed, or to see, although obviously they do see. But the purpose is not individual, it's communal. John is building a case like any good attorney would build as to why Jesus is the Messiah. And so very early on in his ministry, you see that appearing with the wedding at Cana.
Yeah, I think I love the way that you described that, because there are so many miracles that John could have picked from, and yet you see that he's very strategic, even in the ways that he describes them. He says, this is the first sign, the second sign. So he's trying to build, like you said, he's trying to build a case for who Jesus is, and why he should be believed and followed. And so, yeah, I'm excited to dive into these passages.
Yeah, it's fantastic how you're putting it. And we're going to see some structural and literary things that, as you mentioned, are brilliant. And in John's use of language. So, for example, the gospel starts, as you know, with the prologue, chapter 1. And John kind of starts setting the scene, taking us back to creation itself. And then very quickly, John moves away and we land in chapter 2, which is obviously Jesus' first miracle for the uninitiated. Now, for those that know that John is writing to us on several different levels, are understanding right from the outset what John is trying to do. So chapter 2 begins, Joey, with the now kind of words that ought to be understood as code language for something else. John starts by saying, on the third day. And that language immediately draws you in a powerful way, right? Back to the idea of glorification, which will be the second half of John's book.
Yeah, so already from the beginning, he's giving hints of where he's going to land. That phrase also creates a sense of anticipation, because throughout the Old Testament, the third day was when the climax usually hit, right? Something special about to happen because it's the third day, right? Abraham and Isaac journeying to Mount Moriah to sacrifice Isaac. It took them 3 days journey to get there, So you have this sense of like anticipation. John is creating some kind of energy and also hinting, like you said, into something that will happen at the end of the book, the ultimate sign of Jesus's divinity.
And yet, Jesus is very clear, at least the Jesus that John remembers, is very clear with time. So John is a temporal gospel in the sense that you have kind of all these ideas of time, the third day, and this idea, this motif that John will use as he builds his argument, the hour, the hour. The hour. The hour is not yet here. And then finally, at the end of the gospel, the hour has come. Yeah. So Jesus comes into this wedding. He finds Mary. His disciples are there. It's a small town in Cana. And there's a problem. And the mother comes to, Jesus' mother comes to him and says, they have no more wine. To which Jesus responds, woman, why do you involve me? What do you have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. And the question, I think, in the back of the mind of the readers is the hour for what? Yeah. If we're just starting to read this narrative, we've heard the good news. We know that the Word has been made flesh and dwelt among us. But what is this? What does this mean? What is this fleshy word that lives in and amongst us? What is he to do in this realm, in this earth, in this world?
Yeah, and again, John masterfully, I think, setting up that sense of anticipation and that sense of like question, like what's about to happen here? What is the hour that has not come? Why is Jesus hesitant to move forward? Why is he pushing back on Mary? And in the English, we often say that it comes off a little bit harsher than it is in the Greek. This woman, why do you involve me? Calling his mom woman. But this idea that Jesus is, in a sense, pushing back and saying, you want me to do something that I'm not ready to do, in a sense. So why does he phrase it that way? Why does he communicate that and say that to Mary? And why does she respond and say, basically brushing it aside and say, do whatever he tells you to do, right?
Yeah, and you know what's so powerful about that little 2-verse snippet there, that we understand, or at least John is trying to set the stage, that the miracle isn't what's important. What is important is the result of the miracles. And so by Jesus starting his ministry, or by Jesus opening what John calls the book of signs here, now these questions of do you believe or don't you believe have to be asked and answered. And you're so right in noting that Mary's response to Jesus is completely to dismiss him and to turn to the servants and say, do whatever he asks. And many, many, many messages have been preached. Many Bible studies have been had on this particular verse, because we think it's about a lot of things. We think it's about a relationship between Jesus and Mary. We think it's about a wedding. We think it's about, was it grape juice or was it fermented juice? There's a whole really interesting doctoral dissertation on that. There's a lot of things, but I think a lot of us have missed really what John is trying to do with this particular story. Because Mary turns, looks at the servants and says, do whatever he asks you or commands you to do, and then you have some basins of water.
Yeah. This basins of water that the kind, it says in the Bible, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Right. So that detail that John doesn't have to insert, but he does insert in there to let you know what these basins of water were traditionally or were typically used for, which is for the cleansing of people from corruption, from sin, right?
And no, please.
No, go.
So yeah, that's the first thing, right? He tells you what they're for. He also says how many there were. So there's 6 of them. And so John is making a theological point, isn't he, about the rituals that Jews were engaging in to purify themselves.
Yeah, that they're incomplete.
Incomplete. Yeah. 6, the number of incompleteness. All their mikvah baths are not going to actually have the desired effect of purification.
Yeah.
Because it is only when that water becomes wine. And we all know what the wine signifies, right? That's when true purification occurs.
Yeah.
And so, like we said, folks, from the very beginning, this miracle isn't about Jesus having a really nice party that people can attend and say, hey, that wine was really tasty. It's about the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus as the ultimate vehicle for true purification.
Yeah. And that becomes explicit later on when Jesus, he says, this wine is my blood on the Passover. So, and in that way also, again, just like this passage, and I loved how the writer of this lesson pointed back to the book of Exodus, right? And the idea of the Nile turning into blood, right? In that instance, and this is the contrast that again, masterful, that's set up here. In that instance, that water turning into blood brought about death, right? It brought about the death of the creatures within the Nile. Here, the water turning into wine or into blood brings about life. It brings about more joy. It infuses life into this ceremony and this party.
Absolutely. And the beauty of this is it has, at least in the life of the disciples, the desired effect for which John writes this gospel. This is the first sign through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him.
Yeah.
And that's really what's important, the capacity to believe. Now, In order to understand why John is so enamored with this idea of belief, we need to understand the context in which John is writing this gospel. So most scholars will say John is the last gospel to be written, right, somewhere in the late first century. And it is at a time when there is a really interesting debate within the early Christian church, John being kind of a pastor of the church in Ephesus. There's this question about the return of the Messiah, about Jesus returning in the lifetime of his disciples. And I'm assuming, like any father, John is looking at this little community that he has built and is actually very concerned with their capacity to sustain faith after all of the ones who were witness to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection have passed away. And so in a lot of this gospel kind of is undergirded by this idea that Jesus has this message that he has shared with his disciples. But as his disciples die, it is the responsibility of those now who are reading the words that John is writing to maintain that belief and that faith alive, lest we become children of darkness.
I love how you highlight the pastoral heart of John, and that how that undergirds this message, because we ended last week the book of Mark with that emphasis that the gospel needs to be proclaimed, right? That God does not have any grandchildren. He only has direct children, and we're always just one generation away from Christianity disappearing. And it seems like what you're pointing out is that John understands that. And so he writes the book, this gospel, so that they may have belief, so that this even after the eyewitnesses pass away, that belief in this Jesus, the Jesus of signs and wonders, will not fail.
Yeah. Again, John, I think John, not John the gospel writer, John Pauline, looking at this, says that is, and I don't know if I completely agree with him, but I do see that thread there. John says that is the thread throughout the gospel. This idea of this next generation of people believing.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely there. Now, is it the primary thread? Well, we can quibble about that. But John makes a really good case by having us look at kind of Jesus's famous excursus on vines and branches. You are... I am the vine and you are the branches. And so Jesus, the you that Jesus is talking about in that particular case is the disciples. So I am the vine, you are the branches. And then the excursus continues. I desire that you bear much fruit. And so it is kind of this gospel written by a pastor who realizes that he is at the end of his ministry and is now reflecting upon the fruit that him and his comrades have produced, meaning kind of the new nascent church. And it's important. It's important for him that amidst kind of a world that is changing, the church maintain its clear capacity for belief.
Wow. Yeah, that's an aspect that I had not thought about before. But as I reflect on what you're saying and what John said, there definitely seems to be that thread that runs through it, and which is why, again, he says, "I write this so that you may believe." Yeah.
Right. Now, the question then, I think that jumps out, at least to me, Joey, is, okay, what is this church that has been invited to believe? What does it look like? I think John is really good at kind of giving us these motifs.
Yeah.
I honestly think that John is one of these gospels that is made for the herd, for an audience that is hearing. There's some gospels. Matthew, for example. Matthew is great if you're reading it. It's full of simile and these connections. So if you have a working knowledge of the text and you're actually reading and you have your concordance, Matthew's excellent.
Yeah.
I think John reads much more like this really, really long sermon. And in that, I think that John does something that any preacher that is actually attempting to craft a message does really well, and that is the usage of motifs. John is chock full of motifs. And it seems like, at least in this first section of the gospel, the motif that John goes after is water. So John chapter 1, the waters of chaos. John chapter 2, the water becoming wine. John chapter 3, you must be born out of water and the Spirit. John chapter 4, the woman at the well. John chapter 5, the pool of Bethesda, and so on and so forth. If you continue kind of the first half of the gospel, it's all about you are drenched in Johannine water.
Yeah.
And I think the reason for that is that John is creating kind of these motifs to help us remember the story. And at the crux of that story is this question: what do these disciples that are being called to believe, what do they look like? And it's interesting that John then moves to tell, coming right after the story of the disciples believing, John moves us to Nicodemus, who's a disciple that kind of believes and kind of doesn't believe, a woman at a well who completely believes, and then on the heels of the woman at the well, the second story that our lesson deals with, which is the official son, who is, I think, one of the paragons of discipleship within the Johannine narrative. This is a man who truly believes, because the mark of discipleship for John is, do you believe?
I love how you set that up. And just if you didn't catch that, how you masterfully move through the threads of these chapters to connect these two stories. Because what you see in the stories that you highlighted throughout chapters, the end of chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, is this idea of the question is, do you believe? And different people respond in different ways to that question. And then you get to this second sign where he's just highlighting what it means to believe. And I think that's so powerful and so beautiful. This one, and then the following sign, which is the healing at the pool, which the dynamic between how Jesus interacted in the first one, where Mary came up to him and asked him to requested for him to do this. Here, the official son, again, the official comes to Jesus, and then finally in chapter 5, you have Jesus going to the man, which we'll get there.
We'll get there because it's masterfully noted.
I love that journey that you've taken us on. Yeah.
So he's back in Cana, right? And again, John is starting to paint this. For John, it's a very dualistic world. You're either a child of the darkness or you're a child of light. You either believe or you don't believe. You either have quenched your thirst or your lips are parched. John's world is a dualistic world. And in the gospel, there's going to be a marked difference between Galilee and Jerusalem. In Galilee, you find belief. In Jerusalem, you're going to find resistance. This is kind of part of what John is doing.
Wow.
And so from the outset, right, he's already telling us that Jesus now is on friendly ground. Jesus is in a place in which people are much more receptive to the message. And just keep that in the back of your mind. As the next story, you were talking about the dynamic. We've moved away from Galilee and we're not in Jerusalem. And we're now in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I love that. So then after 2 days, it says that in verse 43, after the 2 days he left for Galilee, again, highlighting the fact that he was returning to that ground. Now, Jesus himself had pointed out that prophets have no honor in their own country. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, and they had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, for they had also been there. So there is a sense of almost like he sets up this idea that he's returning to the place where he's had so much success. He's traveled and has come back, and there is some like he's made a name for himself. And yet, John does insert that little bit of how Jesus himself had pointed out that prophets have no honor in their own country, almost hinting at there is still doubt here.
Right.
There are still people who don't fully believe, right? And yet he's going to show a man who will eventually fully believe, right? I don't know if at the beginning of this story, if the royal official really believed or not. I'm not sure because of what Jesus says in verse 48. And I know he's not just talking to just this man, right? He's addressing the entire crowd. He says to them, unless you people see signs and wonders, Jesus told them, you will never believe, right? So he's not just talking to the men. He says, you people, he's talking to the entire crowd there. But he is saying that belief does not just come from seeing the signs and wonders. Can you believe without seeing? And so he's cast that out there, pushes back on this man, sort of pushes back on this man's request to heal his son. He doesn't really answer the question. And the man, again, reaches out. And I love this because there is a sense in Scripture that that a paragon of a demonstration of faith is when God pushes back on you and you grapple with him. Like Jacob grappled with God, right? He wrestled with God. Where God rebuffs Abraham when he's asking him to he's asking him to save Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham, he debates with God. Moses argues with God when God says to him that he's going to destroy the Israelites, and so there is this sense like the people of great faith will not take God's first answer as the answer. They will grapple with him, and this man demonstrates that same type of faith.
Yeah. That's beautifully said. You know what else I love about Jesus? That he's realistic with us. Remember, the whole first half, John chapter 1 to John chapter 11, is all about Jesus performing signs.
Yeah.
So he says, unless you people see signs and wonders, you won't believe. Well, guess what? I am going to give you signs. So he is really, for John, the purpose of and we can't stress this enough because this is kind of, I think if you have to take one point of the first half of John with you as we start this trimester study, is that the purpose of miracles is not for the sake of simply healing someone. The purpose of everything that Jesus does in the first half of the gospel is for you to believe. And so it's almost like Jesus is saying, unless you see signs and miracles, you're not signs and wonders, you won't believe. Well, guess what? We're knee deep in signs right now. We're going to be living and breathing in the book of signs. So here it is. I am going to perform it for you. Now, there is no other person, I think. I think what John does better than any other person is he kind of creates these stories that are held in couplets. So he couples these stories. So we're just out of one of those, prime example, and we're going to jump into kind of the second half of the couplet here in a moment. But you have John chapter 3, Nicodemus, John chapter 4, the woman at the well. And those are to be read as couplets, right? A lot of us say, oh, well, the woman at the well came to Jesus during the day because she was embarrassed. No, the reason why Jesus says the woman came at midday is she's contrasting and comparing with Nicodemus who came at night. And so he's holding these couplets, right? Both of them engage Jesus on theological grounds. The woman understands kind of Jesus's seemingly obscure understanding of theology where he says, I have water and you won't drink and you won't ever thirst again. And she drops her basin there and goes because she's been full. Whereas Nicodemus answers kind of this obscure statement on theology of being born again by asking questions that show that he doesn't understand. So those two stories are to be held in couplets. Here in John chapter 4, Jesus moves from the area of theology to the area of palpable signs. And so he's going to have this royal official, and he's going to say, do you believe? And the official believes to the point where not only does, I love the way that the NIV, and sometimes admittedly the NIV is not my favorite translation, but I think it captures it beautifully in this particular story, Joey. the second half of verse 50 in chapter 4, because that's the key to the couplet. The man took Jesus at his word and departed.
Yeah.
So it's almost as if John is saying, the you here that you mentioned isn't just to the people there, it's to the people hearing the message. Unless you, hearers of the gospel, see signs and wonders, you won't believe. Well, Jesus is in the business of signs and wonders. Do you have the courage to take Jesus at his word? And that's the question kind of that hangs in the air in this whole story.
Yeah. And to this man's credit, he doesn't actually see the signs and wonders before he takes Jesus at his word, right? He takes Jesus at his word and departs before he has any confirmation that his son is healed. It's Jesus' word, your son will live. Now, Jesus does say your son will live, and that gives him the confidence to leave, but he has no evidence that Jesus has actually performed what he has said he has performed.
Right. And what is so powerful there is that, again, the message, yes, we have to look at any gospel or any book of the Bible for that matter, kind of through three lenses. So first, you kind of jump into the story, right? So you are this man. Yeah. Then second, you're the audience, the original audience of the gospel. And third, or I would actually argue first, it's you and the text. But third, it's us talking about this now and the implications that it has for us. But I think in this case, this particular text is understood more deeply when we kind of move a little bit from the original story to actually place ourselves in the scene where it's being heard first and now us today. Because let's be frank, yes, Jesus is in the business of signs and wonders, but sometimes we are not discerning enough to see those signs and wonders. And so the question then for the original hearers of John's gospel, as it is for us now, is do we have the courage to take Jesus at his word?
Yeah.
Because that's the purpose of sharing the gospel. Do you have the courage to believe that this is true?
Wow. And what I love about this, I'm fascinated about what you said about couplets, because you see so many similarities and also contrasts, intentional contrasts between these two stories, much like you do see between Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, right? You see that one is wealthy and royalty, the other one doesn't even have someone who can help him get into the water, right? You see one who's healthy, but his son is sick, and this man who's been sick for all of his life. You see this contrast of someone who's not a Jew and then someone who's outside of that Jewish realm, and then you have the man who's you have Galilee and Jerusalem, that contrast. So this continuing contrast between these two men, and yet both of them take Jesus at his word, right? This man, Jesus says, take up your mat and walk. And before I would have said, Jesus, I can't walk.
Right.
Right? That would have been my answer. Jesus, what do you mean take up my mat? I've been wanting to do that my entire life. Like, I would have argued, the man gets up. He takes Jesus at his word and he gets up.
Right.
And this is before he doesn't even know who Jesus is, right? Because when the religious leaders come up to him later and said, who healed you? He says, well, the guy over there, but I don't see him. He's gone now, right? So this idea that he took Jesus at his word without even fully understanding who Jesus is just a fascinating thing. Both of them do that. They take that step of faith, and though they're from vastly different backgrounds, they still have the same result.
Yes. So that's the first step. Do you have the courage to take Jesus at his word? There's a second step that for John is very important. And so, Joey, we're speaking our love language now, because you see these connections, and the connections don't end there. Go all the way to John chapter 9 and compare the man at the pool of Siloam with the man at the pool of Bethesda, and a whole new vista. And by the way, that's where this section closes. A whole new vista opens up. And we might have some time to talk about that. But so taking Jesus at his word, first step.
Yeah.
Then 53. Uh, so the last half of verse 53, so he, referring to the royal official and his whole household, believed. Period. And so it seems like for John, again, the discipleship of this man is validated in his believing. Now, John uses several ways to validate your discipleship. You believe. In other sections of the gospel, it has to do with your relationship with water. That's why we said that John's drenched in water. So, because baptism is for John the ultimate sign of belief. So the man in chapter 9 at Siloam is washing his eyes, and that whole scene, that has to do with a mini baptism. The woman here in John chapter 4 at the first half, she's now full of this living water. Again, a reference perhaps, at least if you believe people like Gail O'Day, who's a wonderful Johannine scholar, that's baptism. And then you get to Bethesda. And in Bethesda, you have... we want to be generous and believe in grace. So if the royal official gets an A, the man at Bethesda gets an incomplete. Now, there's some scholars that are much less generous with him, but we'll give him an incomplete. So, sometime later, Jesus goes to Jerusalem for one of the festivals, and you know the story, right? There's a man, pool of Bethesda, and there's it's this place where people that have come, and I'm not in love with the NIV translation of verse 3 and 4. Here a great number of disabled people. There's a lot of work, Joey, as you know, being done in the theology of people, theology and people who are differently abled. And so I think that one has to recognize that there's a difference between a physical malady, something that we and being disabled. I don't think in the mind. I don't think to speak of those to equate those is helpful, because really to be disabled is something that is a state that you enter in that isn't created by you. It's created by society. So if I have mobility challenges, and I need to use a wheelchair to get around. Some of our friends that are doing theology from the perspective of people who are differently abled would say, well, that's a physical malady. The disabling piece comes when society doesn't recognize that it needs to make certain things available for me to be able to operate in the same way that other people operate. So there's the physiological problem, but there's also a sense in which disability, I think, often should be best understood as a social construct.
Yeah, that's really well said, because it's something that has been a growing edge for me as well. Because when you think about somebody, like, for example, we make accommodations for ourselves all the time, right? There's a reason why steps are a certain height, right? Because for humans, we don't expect people to be able to take 5-foot steps, right? Because we're not able to take 5-foot steps. So we make accommodations for people, for a certain subset of humanity. We even do it for children. Like, when you walk into restrooms, there are urinals that are lower than other urinals, right? Because we recognize there are some humans that are shorter than other humans. It makes sense. So we make these kinds of accommodations all the time because to be human is to be limited in some form. And yet, what we're growing to learn is that just because somebody may have a certain malady that limits them doesn't mean that they're any lesser. It just means that we need to change the accommodations that we make as a society to make the world just as accessible to them as it does for others who may not have those same limitations.
And Joey, what is powerful about what you just said is that what you find in the conversation that follows isn't just a Jesus that looks on the physical limitation, that and the physical limitations that, as you very articulately pointed out, we all have, but is also looking at the societal construct of disability, and is making a comment, maybe a slight commentary on that as well, because the pool of Bethesda was the place for therapuo. That's the word that the Greek use. That's where we get our word therapy from. It's a place that you come for healing, and yet there aren't the accommodations being made at the pool of Bethesda for real healing to occur. And so there is a very real sense in which Jesus appears in the middle of this place and is making a commentary not just on the state of physical limitation, which the man definitely has, but also on the construct of disability as something that is created by society.
Wow, that's powerful. Wow. I'm excited to see that.
So he's there 38 years,
Yeah.
and Jesus asks him, do you want to get well? An original, do you wish for?
Yeah.
That's a better translation. Do you wish for, or do you will? Do you have the will? That's, I think, another better translation of the original language. Do you wish or do you will to get well? Without having the man answer that question, nothing else can proceed. And we understand now that that John is speaking to us on many different levels: physical well-being, spiritual well-being, societal well-being, to just name a few. And it's funny that in this story, that question never gets answered. So this is why we say that the man at Bethesda gets an incomplete. Because it seems like I give him an incomplete because, let's face it, I am the man at the pool of Bethesda. Jesus will ask you a question: do you wish or do you will to get well? Do you have the wish and the will to become better? And I find that the best answer is an unequivocal yes. Society, spiritually, emotionally, physically, whatever the malady is, the answer ought to be yes. But often what occurs is we respond like this man with a litany of excuses.
Wow. Yeah, that's really powerful, because when I first read this question, do you want to get well, that it's like, Jesus, he obviously wants to get well. I mean, who wouldn't want to get well? And yet the man does not respond the way that you would expect, like, yes, make me well, right? And I don't know, this is sort of going off the exegetical path and sort of going into more of the conjecturing path. I don't know what caused this man to answer this way. Maybe there had been some shame in his life where people said, it's your fault that you're not well. And so he felt the need to justify why he was not well, right? Why he was still sick after so many years, and why he still had this malady. I don't know what made him answer that way. But it is interesting that he doesn't just say yes. Yes, I want to get well. Help me into the water, or I want to get well. Take me to a doctor. He instead says, there's no one to take me to the water.
And it's funny because he says, there's no one to take me to the pool when the water is stirred, which means at that point the water is still. And it seems like the point here again, I'm telling you, Joey, this is why this is my favorite gospel, because it is chock full of these beautiful connections. Jesus is saying, my friend, the water's stirring. I am the water, and I am stirring. And the word that the Greek uses for stirring is the same word that's going to appear in John 11 when Jesus weeps. And Jesus wept, and he was moved. By the Spirit into, like, there was this groaning that he feels when he sees Lazarus's tomb. That's the word. And John is saying something. John is saying, the water is here. and it is stirring.
Mm.
Now, do you want to get well?
Mm.
And the answer to that question is, again, an unequivocal yes. So Jesus then...
Can I stop you for there
Go
for a second?
ahead.
Because I love that connection. So you're saying that even though the physical water that he was looking at was not moving, the water of life was there and he was moved. And really healing happens when God is moved, not when some
when the
random
water's
water is moved. That's so beautiful.
That'll preach, Joey.
Wow.
That'll preach.
That's good.
So he tells him, get up your mat and walk. And he does. Except it's Sabbath. And here if the man at Bethesda gets an incomplete, the Pharisees get an F.
Yeah.
Because they're looking at the mat and not at the man. Why is it, though, Joey, that we spend so much time looking at mats and not men?
Yeah. I think part of it, and I've thought about this because a miracle has just happened here. And they're so blind to it. And I'm like, this is a man who was paralyzed for 38 years. And you care about some regulation? Who cares about that regulation, right? And yet, I mean, I think we see what we want to see, right? I think there is a sense that our preconceptions sometimes are so strong that it's difficult for us to see what we're not expecting to see. And we see that throughout the Gospels. We also see it in our own lives. I remember I was talking to a pastor on the Reformation tour, and they were sharing how they were at a potluck, and there was they had a member of their church who was kind of a potluck policeman, right? You know, I'm sure we've all had people like that.
Yes.
Making sure that the proper food is the food that's served in potluck. And I understand the need to safeguard some of our principles about health and all of those things. But sometimes how that's done is done in a way that it turns people away from who Jesus is rather than brings them near, right? So this potluck policeman, this is apparently a new member to the church, didn't realize some of those, so that it would be inappropriate to bring fish to the potluck, and so they brought fish, and the pastor, knowing what may happen, tried to head it off by going to this man ahead of time and said, hey, there's a new man, he just brought fish to the potluck, and you know, so just be aware of that. He's a new member to our church. He doesn't understand some of the things that we're trying to promote. And the man said, okay, as long as he doesn't do it again. To which the pastor kind of felt the need to kind of prod a little bit and said, well, you know, Jesus ate fish.
Right.
And the man's response was, well, if he had had Ellen White,
Oh, my goodness.
he wouldn't have. And again, I mean, thinking about that, how ridiculous that sounds, right? That Jesus, the Son of God, right? God incarnate, would need a human prophet to correct him on what he needs to eat is just, it sounds ridiculous. And yet, when you're in a certain mindset, when you see something from a certain it's so hard to see anything else. And as much as we lay into the Pharisees for doing this, for their blindness, I'm sure there's so many times that we are blind.
There are.
And we don't see the miracles like you have said.
Yeah, you know, that... wow, we've heard some stories here. That's up there. That's up there. So fish is taboo, but we're gonna do casserole with 7 different types of cheese and sour cream on top, and that's okay. Mats, not men.
Yeah.
John is also writing, right, Joey, to a community that because they're calling on Jesus, their belief is being threatened because the support systems that aid in that belief are kind of breaking down. So this movement that it started as a very Jewish movement is now experiencing kind of people being kicked out of the synagogues. And so a lot of people say, that John chapter 9 that's the undercurrent there. But I think the same thing kind of applies to John chapter 5. This man doesn't know who Jesus is. They ask him. He says, I don't know who it was. And then Jesus finds him and says something that I just want to get your thoughts on in like 20 seconds. And then the man goes and tells the leaders, hey, by the way, I'm not him. That's the guy. He's the one to blame. His name is Jesus. And then, which might help us to understand a little bit, Jesus's comment to the man in verse 14, see, you are well again, stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. Because that's a theologically problematic statement, especially because John chapter 9, for example, makes it abundantly clear that sin and disease are not linked. And so it seems here that Jesus is playing into kind of that correlation between sin and disease with the last comment he makes to the former invalid at Bethesda. Why do you think that is?
I think Jesus is pointing out that he's healed, but he's not well.
That's why he gets an incomplete, folks. Joey, as always, was able to give a really concise point in 4 words or less. He's healed, but he's not well.
And how many of us live in that limbo, right? Jesus has healed us. He's healed us time and time again. We're still broken. So I love how you said he gets an incomplete because we see ourselves in this story. We are that man who's living in that limbo. And will we believe? Will we follow? Will we pursue wellness rather than just the momentary healing?
That's a beautiful way to close, Joey. Pray us out.
Our good and gracious God, thank you for being a God who who doesn't only sit back and sees if we'll come to you. You actually seek us out even when you know that we will reject you, that we will turn around and betray you. You still do that. So help us to pursue you at least a fraction of the way that you pursue us. Help us to seek not just healing, but wellness and wholeness in our lives is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So, my friend, be well until we see you next time. May God bless you.